If you have ever been made to feel like you were not enough by someone who stood at the altar and promised to love you, this story is going to reach right into your chest. Like this video right now and subscribe to this channel, because what Steve Harvey said to one husband on national television in front of millions of people is something that man will never forget, and neither will anyone who watched it. Let us get into it. Hiok begins. There is a form of cruelty that wears the face of honesty. It arrives with phrases like just being real with you or I am only saying this because I care. It positions itself as candor and calls any objection to it oversensitivity. It is, in practice, the most corrosive form of unkindness available within a marriage, because it cannot be named without the person naming it appearing thin-skinned, and because it accumulates over years into something that alters the way its recipient sees themselves in a mirror. On a Monday afternoon in a television studio in Atlanta, a man named Gary Tillman stood on the Family Feud stage and, in the course of a 2-minute pre-game introduction, made 3 separate comments about his wife's appearance. He made them in the way he always made them, lightly, as though he were an honest man doing his wife the service of keeping things real. He had been making them, in one form or another, for 16 years. His wife, Sandra, had heard every version of every one of them. She had absorbed them with the patience of a woman who had been taught that a good marriage required tolerance, and with the particular tiredness of someone who has been tolerating the same thing for a very long time. She was not, on that Monday afternoon, expecting anything to be different. She had not reckoned on Steve Harvey. Sandra Tillman was 47 years old when she stood on that stage. She had been born and raised in Birmingham, Alabama, the middle child of 3 in a household defined by her mother's warmth and her father's quiet, consistent steadiness. Her father, a postal worker for 31 years, had been the kind of man who never raised his voice and never needed to, whose authority was expressed entirely through reliability, and whose children understood, without being told, that they were completely safe. Her mother had worked as a school secretary and had the gift of making every child who walked through the front office feel like they mattered. Sandra had inherited both things, her father's steadiness and her mother's gift for making people feel seen. She had studied early childhood education at the University of Alabama at Birmingham and spent the first decade of her working life as a kindergarten teacher, a job she described in every interview she ever gave for the rest of her life as the best thing she had done professionally. She was, by every account of every parent and colleague who worked with her across those years, an exceptional teacher. Patient, creative, and possessed of the specific understanding that children learn best when they feel safe, which meant that her classroom was always the one where the difficult children eventually found their footing. She had left teaching at 34 when her youngest child arrived and childcare costs made the economics difficult. She had not returned to the classroom since, though she had maintained her certification and had, over the intervening years, done substitute work and tutoring in ways that kept her connected to the field she loved without yet being able to return to it fully. She volunteered twice a week at the local public library's early literacy program. She ran the children's Sunday school at her church. The work was not paid, and it was not given the designation of career, and for a woman of her skill and history, that gap had quietly cost her something in terms of how she was perceived, including, over time, how she was perceived by her husband. Gary Tillman was a floor manager at a regional distribution warehouse. He had worked there for 20 years and was, by his own account and by his employers, a capable and reliable employee. He was also, in the private life of his marriage, a man who had developed the habit of using his wife's appearance as a recurring site of commentary. The comments had begun early in the marriage and had evolved over 16 years from occasional and arguably well-intentioned observations into a pattern so established that Gary no longer appeared to register them as commentary at all. They were, in his framing, simply honesty, simply the way things were. The comments concerned Sandra's weight, which had changed over the course of a marriage and 2 pregnancies in the way that bodies change over the course of a marriage and 2 pregnancies. They concerned her clothing choices, which Gary regularly described as either too casual or insufficiently put together. They concerned the way she wore her hair, the amount of effort he felt she did or did not apply to her appearance before social occasions, and the general question of whether she was, in his estimation, presenting herself as well as she could. He did not make these comments out of malice. He made them out of a genuine belief that he was being helpful, which was possibly the most important thing to understand about him and possibly the most important thing that Steve Harvey would eventually address. Sandra had raised the issue with Gary on numerous occasions over the years. Each time, the conversation had followed the same general shape. Gary would express surprise that she was hurt, would reframe the comments as concern rather than criticism, and would arrive at a position in which Sandra's discomfort was the thing requiring examination rather than the comments that had produced it. She had stopped raising it directly some years earlier. The energy required was not proportionate to the outcome. The Family Feud application was their daughter Keisha's idea. Keisha was 24, studying social work, and had watched her parents' dynamic for long enough to have a clear-eyed view of it that she had never been quite sure how to act on. She applied on behalf of the family partly because she genuinely wanted to do something fun with them, partly because she had a specific and not fully conscious hope that a public setting, a setting where her father would not be the authority in the room, might produce something different. She had not discussed this with Sandra. She had discussed it, briefly, with her older brother Marcus, who had simply said, "Hope you know what you are doing." Keisha had said, "Me too." The Tillman family arrived at the studio on a Monday morning. Sandra, Gary, Keisha, Marcus, and Sandra's sister Phyllis, who had been added to complete the five-person team and who had known Sandra for 47 years and had, accordingly, a fairly comprehensive understanding of what the day might produce. Phyllis had dressed for the occasion with particular care, in the way that women who are supporting their sisters through difficult things sometimes dress, as though looking composed is a form of solidarity. The family they were facing, the Coleman family from Memphis, were generous and loud and immediately easy to like. They had the natural chemistry of a family that expresses affection through good-natured competition, and their pre-show energy was warm and uncomplicated. The Tillmans were, externally, equally presentable. Sandra had taken care with her appearance that morning. She always took care, which was its own quiet form of endurance, and looked, by any observable measure, entirely well. Steve Harvey's pre-game introductions began with the Colemans, who gave him immediate and generous material. Then he turned to the Tillmans. He started with Marcus, who was easy and brief. He reached Phyllis, who was dry and composed. He reached Keisha, who delivered a line about her father that got the room laughing, and that contained, for anyone paying close enough attention, a quality that was not quite affection and not quite warning but something that moved between the two. Steve reached Sandra. "Sandra, tell me about yourself." Sandra told him. The library program, the church work, the teaching years. She spoke about it with the straightforward pride of someone who knows the value of what they have done and is not accustomed to having that value reflected back to them in the terms they would use themselves. Steve listened and nodded and said that 20 years of working with young children, paid or not, was one of the most consequential things a person could do with their time. Sandra said thank you in a way that was quiet enough and brief enough that Steve paused, not visibly, not for long, but with the specific quality of attention that he extends to moments that contain more than their surface suggests. He moved to Gary. Gary was comfortable and expansive. He talked about his job, his family, his pride in his children. Steve asked him about Sandra. How long had they been married? What had kept things going for 16 years? Gary smiled and said that marriage was work and that you had to be honest with each other even when it was hard to hear. Honest about what kinds of things? Steve asked. The question was conversational in its delivery and entirely precise in its intent. Gary, reading it as an invitation rather than a probe, said everything. Like Sandra knows I will always tell her the truth, whether it is about, how she is looking that day, or whether she has put the effort in. I am not one of those guys who just tells his wife what she wants to hear. I think women appreciate a man who keeps it real. The studio went quiet in the way it goes quiet when something has been said that a room full of people has immediately and collectively assessed. Steve Harvey looked at Gary with the expression of a man who has just been handed something he did not ask for and has decided, very quickly, what to do with it. "Tell her how she is looking that day," Steve repeated. His voice was perfectly even. "Say more about that for me." Gary, still unaware of the direction he had just set himself in, elaborated. "He said that Sandra sometimes let herself go a little." His words. And that as her husband he felt it was his job to keep her motivated. He said that he meant it with love. He said that he thought she was beautiful when she tried. The last sentence landed in the room like a stone in still water. When she tried. Steve Harvey said nothing for a moment. He looked at Sandra, who was looking straight ahead with the particular quality of stillness that Phyllis, standing beside her, recognized immediately as the stillness of a woman who has heard this so many times that she no longer reacts to it in public, which is a different thing entirely from it not affecting her. Then he looked back at Gary. "I want to stop here for a second," Steve said. Not loudly, with complete control. "Because I think something just happened in this room that needs to be addressed before we play a single question." Steve Harvey draws the line. The studio, which had been warm and energetic through the Coleman introductions, was now completely still. The Coleman family, standing 20 feet away, were watching with the focused attention of people who understand they are witnessing something that has nothing to do with them and everything to do with something real. "Gary," Steve said, "I am going to ask you a question and I need you to think carefully before you answer it. When you say Sandra is beautiful when she tries, what does she look like when she is not trying?" Gary blinked. The question had the quality of a very clean cut, simple on the surface, precise in its depth. He started to answer and then heard himself starting to answer and stopped. I mean, she always looks fine." "That is not what you just said," Steve said. "You just told a studio full of people, and the cameras and everyone watching at home, that your wife is beautiful when she tries. That sentence only means one thing, Gary. It means that when she is not performing for your assessment, she falls short of it. And I need you to understand what that does to a person. Not in theory. To this person, to Sandra, right here." Gary opened his mouth, closed it. For the first time in the introduction, the ease was entirely gone. Steve turned to Sandra. His voice shifted, not in volume but in quality, the way a room shifts when a window opens. "Sandra, how long has this been going on?" Sandra looked at Steve Harvey with the expression of a woman deciding, in real time, how much of herself to offer to a moment she has not prepared for. Then she said, 16 years, since almost the beginning. "And how has it made you feel?" "Not then. Right now. Today." A pause. The kind that comes from a person reaching for the honest answer rather than the manageable one. "Like I have never been quite enough," she said. "Like I am always one effort away from being acceptable. Like the way I look on any given day is something that requires his approval to be valid." The room received that. Received it fully, without applause, without reaction, with the specific quality of silence that is not absence but presence. "The kind that means we heard you." Steve Harvey nodded slowly. Then he turned back to Gary, and what followed was not a speech in the traditional sense, not a prepared, structured address. It was something more direct and more uncomfortable than that. It was one man talking to another man who needed to hear something he had never been made to hear before. "Gary, I want you to look at your wife. Look at her right now." Gary looked at Sandra. "What do you see?" Gary was quiet for a moment. Then, haltingly, "I see my wife. I see someone I love." "Then say that. Say that today, tomorrow, and every day after. Because here is what I know from standing here watching you both for the last 10 minutes. Your wife woke up this morning and got herself ready and came to a television studio and stood here beside you, and she is presenting herself with more grace and dignity than this situation has any right to expect from her. That is not the behavior of a woman who does not try. That is the behavior of a woman who has been trying her whole marriage and has never once been told it was enough." Gary said nothing. His jaw was set and his eyes were bright in the way that a man's eyes go bright when he is doing the specific interior work of recognizing something about himself that he cannot unknow. "I am not saying you are a bad man," Steve continued. "I am saying you have been doing a harmful thing for a long time while believing it was a helpful thing. And those two things can both be true at the same time. But only one of them is what matters to the person standing next to you. Only one of them is what she has been living with. And I genuinely think, that if you look at her right now and really look, you already know which one it is." The room held its breath. Gary turned to Sandra. When he spoke, the performance was gone. All of it, the warehouse floor confidence, the 16-year certainty that he had been doing her a favor. "I am sorry," he said. "I did not understand what I was doing, but I hear it now. I am sorry, Sandra." Sandra looked at her husband for a long moment. Then she said, quietly and with the complete composure of a woman who has already decided who she is regardless of this moment, "Thank you. That is a start." Keisha, standing at the end of the line, looked at the ceiling briefly and then looked back down. Her expression was the expression of a young woman who applied for a television game show and got, instead, the conversation her family had needed for 16 years. Steve Harvey looked at both of them. Then he looked out at the audience. Then he said, simply, "Let us play some Family Feud." The applause that greeted that sentence was the longest and most sustained of the entire taping. The Tillmans won the main game. It was not a foregone conclusion. The Colemans were sharp and competitive and pushed them through the final round. But it was decisive, and it was driven primarily by Sandra, who played with the particular focus of someone who has just been handed something to play for beyond the game itself. She read the board quickly and accurately, gave the top answer on 3 consecutive questions in the middle rounds, and managed the team through the final stack with the precision of a woman who spent 10 years teaching 5-year-olds to think under gentle pressure. Gary played well and without his earlier ease, or rather, without the performance that had passed for ease in the pre-game introduction. He was quieter, more deliberate, more visibly attentive to the people around him than he had been when the cameras first found him. Whether that would last was a question the afternoon could not answer, but in the room on that day the change was real and the room recognized it. For fast money, Keisha went first. She was direct and instinctive and scored 138 points, which left Sandra needing 62 from 5 questions. When she stepped to the fast money podium, the studio had the quality it had held since the pre-game sequence. Charged, attentive, carrying the weight of something larger than a game, Steve walked up beside her. He did not preamble. He simply looked at her and said, "You ready?" "I have been ready for a long time," Sandra said. The audience heard that and responded. Steve smiled, the full, unhurried smile of a man who genuinely appreciates a well-delivered line, and said, "Then let us go. Name something a woman does every morning that takes more effort than people realize." Sandra answered without any pause at all, "Gets herself ready." The board turned. Number 1 answer, 42 points. Phyllis, standing at the side of the stage, pressed both hands flat together and raised them slightly, a gesture that required no translation. Name a word that describes a woman who has been underestimated. Half a second. Capable. Number 1 answer, 38 points. The room was already standing. Name something people say when they finally feel seen. Sandra looked at the board with the calm of someone who knows the answer before the question is finished. About time. Number 1 answer, 31 points. The 20,000 was won. Nobody moved. Name something a wife wishes her husband understood about her daily life. Quietly, with total certainty. How much she carries. Number 1 answer, 44 points. Last question. Name something that gets more beautiful the longer you look at it. Sandra Tillman stood at the fast money podium of the Family Feud stage in a television studio in Atlanta on a Monday afternoon that had not gone as anyone in the room had expected, and she thought about 47 years of being the middle child who figured things out quietly, about 10 years in a classroom where every difficult child eventually found their footing, about 16 years of being told she was beautiful when she tried, which was another way of saying she was not beautiful when she was simply herself, about a Tuesday in Birmingham when her father, The postal worker who never raised his voice had looked at her before a school play and said, "You are exactly right as you are." She thought about that for exactly the length of time it took to let the thought arrive fully. Then she answered, "A real woman," she said. The board turned. Number 1 answer, 46 points. The studio erupted with the full-throated unanimity that a room produces when it has been building toward something for a long time and finally arrives there. Sandra stood at the podium and received it with her hands at her sides and her chin level and her eyes bright, not with the brightness of someone overwhelmed, but with the brightness of someone who has just heard the truth said correctly in public for the first time and is allowing herself to feel exactly what that costs and exactly what it is worth. Steve Harvey walked to the center of the stage and turned to the cameras. His voice, when he spoke, had the quality it reserves for the moments when he is not the host of a game show, but a man with something specific to say. "I want to say something to every man watching this right now," he said. "Not just to Gary. To every man. Your wife, your partner. The woman who wakes up beside you every morning and does everything she does every day. She is not a project. She is not something requiring your ongoing assessment and correction. She is a person. A complete, whole, fully formed person whose value does not fluctuate based on whether you have approved of how she looks on a given morning. And when you treat her like she is, when you make your honest opinion of her appearance a regular feature of her life without her asking for it, you are not being a good partner. You are slowly, consistently telling her that she is not enough. And she hears it. Every time. She hears it." He paused. "Sandra Tillman got herself ready this morning and came here and stood beside a man who has been saying that to her for 16 years. And she played 5 fast money questions today with more grace and more precision than most people manage under no pressure at all. That is not luck. That is a woman who has been building herself from the inside for a very long time, in the absence of the acknowledgement she deserved, and who has enough of herself intact to still do this beautifully. That deserves to be said. Out loud. In front of people." He looked at Gary one final time. "You have a remarkable wife, Gary. I hope today is the day you start acting like you know that." The episode aired 5 weeks after taping. The clip of Steve Harvey's pre-game exchange with Gary and the fast money round that followed it reached 12 million views within 24 hours of broadcast. By the end of the first week it was at 27 million, the largest first-week figure the show's social media team had seen in several years, and notably higher in sustained engagement than an initial spike, which the team attributed to the clip's circulation through communities not typically associated with game show content, health and wellness spaces, relationship counseling forums, early childhood education networks, and the broad, interconnected communities of women who share content that names something they have been trying to name themselves. The comment that appeared most consistently was not a response to Steve Harvey's speech, though that was shared extensively. It was a response to Sandra's final fast money answer. A real woman. Hundreds of thousands of people wrote variations of the same thing, that they had watched that answer arrive, had seen the board confirm it, and had felt something release in them that they could not entirely explain. The word that people used most often, in comments across every platform, was recognized, not moved, not inspired, recognized. What changed after the cameras stopped? Sandra gave one interview, 3 months after the episode aired, to a publication focused on women in education. She was precise and characteristically unglamorous about what the day had meant and what it had produced. She said that the afternoon had not transformed her marriage overnight, which she described as an unrealistic expectation of any single event, however significant. What it had done was introduce a reference point, a moment in time that both she and Gary could point to when the old patterns resurfaced, which they did, because 16-year habits do not dissolve in an afternoon. They had, she said, begun couples counseling 4 weeks after the taping. Gary had suggested it, which she described without commentary beyond the fact of it. The sessions were ongoing. Progress was real and incomplete in equal measure, which she described as the accurate description of most genuine progress. She had returned to teaching. Not immediately. The opportunity had arrived 2 months after the broadcast, When the principal of a local elementary school had seen the episode, had known of Sandra's background, and had reached out directly, Sandra had accepted a part-time position teaching a morning reading intervention class for second graders identified as struggling with literacy. She described the first morning back in a classroom as the most straightforwardly right she had felt in several years. Keisha, in the brief comments she made publicly, said simply that she had applied for Family Feud hoping something would shift and had not expected it to shift that much, that fast, in that particular direction. She added that she had been having a version of the conversation with her father for years without it landing. Steve Harvey said the same things I have been saying, she said, and it landed differently. I have complicated feelings about that, but I am glad it landed. Steve Harvey on the specific harm of appearance commentary. In the months following the episode, Steve Harvey was asked about the Tillman family in several contexts and addressed the themes of his intervention with unusual specificity. He was careful to distinguish between the category of harm he had witnessed, a man using ongoing commentary about his wife's appearance as a form of control he had reframed as care, and broader questions about honesty in marriage, which he did not dismiss. There is a version of honesty in a relationship that is actually service, he said in one interview, where your partner asks for your opinion and you give it honestly because that is what they need. That is not what Gary was doing. Gary was providing unsolicited, recurring assessments of his wife's physical presentation and calling it love. Those are different things. The first one, the partner asked for. The second one, the partner did not ask for and could not refuse. And the difference between those two things is not subtle. It is the difference between care and control. He also spoke about the specific dimension of appearance commentary that distinguishes it from other forms of marital criticism. When a person's physical appearance is the recurring subject of their partner's assessments, the effect is not merely that they feel criticized, it is that their body, the thing they cannot remove and cannot leave behind, becomes the site of their inadequacy. They carry the criticism everywhere, literally. It is present in every mirror, every social situation, every morning. That is not an incidental harm, it is a comprehensive one. The framing of appearance commentary as control rather than care was widely circulated and generated extended discussion in relationship counseling communities, several of which incorporated the episode into educational materials used with couples presenting with similar dynamics. Sandra and her father's words in the interview Sandra gave 3 months after the broadcast. She was asked about the fast money round, specifically about the final answer, a real woman, and where it had come from. She was quiet for a moment before answering, in the way she was quiet before answers that mattered to her. She said that when Steve Harvey had asked her that final question, she had thought about her father, about a Tuesday in Birmingham when she was 7 years old, and had been anxious about a school play, worried about whether she looked right, whether she was enough. Her father had crouched down to her level and said, "You are exactly right as you are." She had not thought about that memory in years. It had arrived, on the Family Feud podium, with complete clarity and complete force. She had answered from it. The board said number 1, she said. But I was answering my father's question, not Steve Harvey's. I was answering the question of whether I was enough. And I was saying yes, I am, I always was. Sandra's mother, who had watched the episode at the family home in Birmingham with Sandra's father, called her the morning after it aired. Her father had watched the whole thing without speaking, which was consistent with who he had always been. After the final answer was revealed and the applause had filled the studio, he had said 4 words. Her mother had written them down and read them to Sandra over the phone. I told her so. You are exactly right as you are. That was what Sandra's father had said to her at 7 years old in a hallway in Birmingham, Alabama, on the night of a school play she was anxious about. 40 years later, his daughter stood on a game show stage and answered a survey question from that memory, and the board confirmed it, and the room confirmed it, and 27 million people confirmed it over the days that followed, not because the answer was surprising, because it was true, because it had always been true, and because the particular cruelty of what had happened inside Sandra's marriage was not that she had been told she was ugly. She had never been told that, and Gary would have been genuinely horrified by the suggestion. The cruelty was quieter and more lasting than that. She had been told for 16 years and in 100 small formulations that she was right when she tried, which was another way of saying she was not right as she was. Her father had told her otherwise at 7. The board at Family Feud confirmed it at 47. The 40 years between those two moments are the story. And the story is not about Gary, and it is not about Steve Harvey, and it is not finally about the game show, or the prize money, or the viral clip. It is about a woman in Birmingham who was told the true thing early and spent the middle years of her life in a house where a different thing was being said, and who found her way back to the true thing on a Monday afternoon in Atlanta when a man with a microphone asked the right question, and she answered it from the right place. Sandra Tillman is back in a classroom on Tuesday and Thursday mornings teaching second graders to read. She is, by every account of every colleague and parent, exactly the teacher she always was. She is, by her own account, exactly right as she is.